Burr, Capito, Collins, Cornyn, Crapo, Daines, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Flake, Gardner, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Johnson, Kennedy, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Perdue, Roberts, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Scott, Strange, Sullivan, Tillis, Toomey, Wicker, Young. Senators voting in the negative: Cardin, Casey, Duckworth, Durbin, Harris, Heinrich, Kane, Leahy, Murray, Reed. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, no. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, no. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye.
It's 48 yes and 16 no. I think they need 51. So I don't know who the three that
Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker, aye.
Okay, it's at 50. So now I'm not sure the vice president can be an extra vote or if he has to only vote if he can break the tie.
Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand.
It's Rand Paul.
Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, no.
quick photo here.
Mr. Chester. Mr. Chester. No. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin. No. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren. No.
I'm not gonna pause here. They're probably gonna do some more votes, but it looks like he's got the confirmation.